Good afternoon. It's always tough to be last on the program, but it hopefully won't be as bad as the time I was speaking to a group of local executives, and they were running behind, and I was last, so they just went ahead and opened the bar in the back of the room when I started. It's an honor to be here today and to participate in a program that is filled with ideas and discussion and dialogue that can be helpful to not only every participant in this room, but to the Commonwealth as a whole. I tried to think of a way to make this topic a little more exciting. I even considered changing the title to reflect the interest in the hottest new erotic bestseller called 50 Shades of Grey. But somehow 50 Shades of Accountability didn't have the same ring. Accountability isn't sexy. But to address every single issue that has been part of this agenda at this conference, it's vital that Kentuckians hold all of our leaders accountable, from the very lowest level elected positions to the highest. And there are at least 50 shades of accountability, ranging from not breaking the law at the very basic level to that broader leadership responsibility that includes making principled decisions when faced with difficult choices. That's accountability too. And to secure the future that Kentucky desperately needs, we have to have accountability from every one of our leaders at each of those levels. And the private sector is the key to holding public leaders accountable. You've heard that again and again today about the value of public-private partnerships. Now, the Chamber's focus on government modernization has been to improve efficiencies. And I would challenge us to also think of modernization in the broader sense, to include recruiting and electing future leaders at every level of government who will bring integrity and strategic vision to leadership to address the very issues that you have been discussing here. But let's begin by touching on the technical aspects of government modernization and government efficiency. You know, the Chamber identified modernization as one of its core strategies of the strategic plan for the Chamber several years ago. In fact, in 2008, I was invited here to talk about some of the past attempts at modernizing government in Kentucky because I've been present at several of those. I tried to get my staff when I was in the auditor's office to take out of that bio that I'm beginning my 4th decade and ask if we couldn't at least cut a decade off and maybe no one would notice. But I have been around for a long time, and I've seen a lot of beginnings and I've seen a lot of ends of various initiatives. The first significant government efficiency initiative in recent years was in the early 90s during the Brereton-Jones administration. I was part of that commission called the Commission on Quality and Efficiency, and it led to a document called the Wake-Up Call. That commission worked 6 months with private sector leadership to create a report with over 100 recommendations. John Cubine, who's here today and helping as a consultant on the report that was just released, actually was the staff director of that commission. And I know John joins me in remembering that many of the topics we were addressing in that year are the same topics we're talking about today. There were 55 members of that Quality and Efficiency Commission in the 90s. 35 of them were private sector leaders, and it was led by now Mayor of Lexington, Jim Gray. That report came out with a little over a year left in the Jones administration before the Patton administration. And I made the transition also, where I had served as Secretary of Finance for Governor Jones, to move over to be in the governor's office under Governor Patton. And we watched as the administration changed, many of the things that had been top priorities in the Jones administration didn't get full consideration in the Patton administration. And that's been one of our challenges in Kentucky time and time again. When an administration changes and the political leadership changes, the priorities change. So it makes it difficult to have a sustained commitment. But we did begin to help implement many of the suggestions that grew out of the old Quality and Efficiency Commission. In 1995, Governor Patton took office, and when he did, I was in a role where I was responsible for implementing his policy agenda. And that was a governor, you could hear it today in his comments, that was a governor who had a very strong, well-defined strategic agenda. He knew that he had to focus on issues and priorities that would make a difference in Kentucky in the next 20 years, the next 50 years. And it was my job to try to keep up with him and try to keep track of it all and try to keep our cabinet on track in terms of implementing what his priorities were. But what he did as part of his initial priority setting in his administration was to establish a strategic agenda that had as a priority strengthening the financial condition of state government. And to do that, as a tactic to reach that goal, Governor Patton launched his effort to streamline state government and make it more efficient with an initiative called Empower Kentucky. And Empower stood for empowering our workers with effective resources. If you remember, his first cabinet secretary in that administration was Margaret Greene, who took a leave from her role as president of Bell South Kentucky to help launch Empower Kentucky, bringing her private sector skills to that important initiative. After her return, 6 months into the Patton administration to Bell South, I became Secretary of the Cabinet, and I picked up the responsibility for implementing and overseeing that project. And fortunately, that initiative did pick up on some of the major themes of the Jones Initiative, which included investing in technology as an enabler of a more efficient government. In Empower Kentucky, we used business process reengineering to analyze 19 different key processes of state government and recommend efficiencies. But here's where it really got interesting. Governor Patton asked the General Assembly to fund $100 million in one-time spending for technology, with a commitment that our reengineering efforts would result in $50 million in annual recurring savings. His goal was to free up resources that could be invested in more strategic areas, such as higher education, that would strengthen the economy. Exactly the kind of approach you've been hearing about here that we have to have in Kentucky. How can we free up money that we are spending and move it to other areas that are more strategic investments? And Governor Patton did just what he promised he would do. Not many people remember this. I know a couple of the folks who were in higher education at the time may, Dr. Ransdell included. But the first savings from Empower Kentucky produced the funds to finance the Higher Education Reform Act that was passed in 1997, which, among other things, launched the new community and technical college system that you heard great success stories from today, and the highly successful Bucks for Brains initiative. Empower Kentucky's efforts eventually captured over $600 million in savings, and it was hailed as a national model. But then, as the Patton administration neared the end of his second four-year term, we evolved Empower Kentucky into what we called the Center for Excellence in Government, designed to be a permanent office that would direct continuous improvement initiatives in state government. Now, no one here will remember hearing about that office because it lasted about 15 minutes into the next administration. It was abolished by the incoming administration, and that ended the momentum in government reengineering. Under the current administration, Governor Beshear has put a strong emphasis on transparency, naming a public-private e-transparency task force that helped to launch a website that's been recognized nationally for giving taxpayers a window into state government spending. And the governor has appointed business leaders to the Tax Reform Commission, currently developing proposals for tax reform, which the Pew Center for the States yesterday had in a headline, "Kentucky is studying tax reform again," because it is something we have revisited, as you know, time and again, and hopefully this time we will try to see some results that show some sort of bipartisan cooperation. But I mentioned these previous government efficiency initiatives because there are a couple of lessons to be learned from them. One, private sector involvement has been vital in any successes we've seen. The state needs the skills and the expertise of business leaders. And two, and this is true for any initiative, not just government modernization, without sustained support and continuing demand for accountability from outside government, there's no continuity that results in ongoing change. We've seen that time and again. But modernizing government in Kentucky has to encompass more than reengineering efforts within the bureaucracy. Truly modernizing government has to include electing leaders at every level who are committed to positive change, and then holding them accountable to delivering on those commitments. I spent the last 8 years serving as the state's elected auditor of public accounts. And prior to that, I've worked with 6 Kentucky governors in jobs ranging from the bottom to the top in state government. And through those experiences, I've learned as much about why leaders fail as why they succeed. And if there's one key lesson I've learned along the way, it's that having strong personal values and holding ourselves to the highest ethical standards are the most important determinants of a leader's success. And never has the value of that moral compass been more clear to me than during my time in the state auditor's office. As I look back over that tenure of the last 8 years, it's my hope that the legacy of our work during that time lies not in that series of controversial audit results you saw in the headlines, but in a heightened sense of accountability on the part of those who hold the public's trust across the Commonwealth. We learned some valuable lessons along the way in the auditor's office that relate to the broader theme of accountability in leadership. In the area of local government audits, our work resulted in 35 criminal prosecutions of local public officials or employees across the state, convicted in very varied schemes to basically embezzle money or steal from the taxpayers for their own personal benefit. Now, that's not a number I'm proud of as a Kentuckian, because what that means is we still have too many pockets in this state where there is a culture of corruption that has historically hampered progress. And I took seriously my responsibility as the elected auditor, the watchdog, to help break that cycle. But what kind of lessons can we take from all of those troubling local audits as we think about Kentucky's future? First, it's vital that every local government takes seriously the establishment and enforcement of local ethics codes and proper policies and controls. Those are the basic nuts and bolts issues of accountability at the local level. But even more important, our citizens in every Kentucky county must expect more and demand more of their local elected leaders. They must become positive forces for change at the grassroots level when they suspect abuse of the public trust and when they are choosing their elected leaders. We also conducted a high-profile series of special audits of board-governed organizations that are funded with public dollars, including the Lexington Bluegrass Airport, the Kentucky League of Cities, the Kentucky Association of Counties, Passport Health Plan here in Louisville, as well as Metropolitan Sewer District here. That series of audits contained disturbing and in some cases shocking results, ranging from conflicts of interest and excessive spending to questionable procurement practices and weak board oversight. Most of what people remember are that they used the public credit card to go to the strip club. But I think there are some very broad lessons, again, that can be learned from those series of audits. We found that in too many cases, public boards lack a basic understanding of their legal and fiduciary responsibilities. We learned that there's a gap between the accountability expected from government agencies and that required from agencies which operate at arm's length from direct government control. What happened at the Lexington Airport, as an example, could have happened in any organization. There was a well-respected board of business and community leaders. The outward image was of a well-run and efficient facility. The planes were landing on time. But in the end, those ultimately accountable for governance abdicated their responsibility. Too much trust was placed in staff without proper oversight, and the results included 4 criminal indictments and guilty pleas for staff, for the top staff. And the organization's reputation was fundamentally damaged. Now, accepting responsibility is really the key to accountability. Each individual in an organization, from the lowest employee to the chairman of the board, from the sheriff to the congressman, has a responsibility to those whose trust they hold. There's been dramatic and positive change from that series of audits of board-governed organizations. All of them resulted in significant changes in leadership. Each organization responded by taking aggressive steps to adopt the audit recommendations. And on a broader front, dozens of public and nonprofit boards across the state have sought to learn from the audits we conducted, benefiting from a document produced by the Auditor's Office detailing recommendations for all public and nonprofit boards. But these controversies should not have a chilling effect for citizens willing to step forward and serve on public boards. We have hundreds of such volunteers across the state and in this community who serve admirably and selflessly. And I'm sure many of you in this room serve on public and nonprofit boards. The legacy of those audits to those board volunteers is a set of clearer directions and higher expectations. The body of work from those last years in the Auditor's Office provided thousands of concrete recommendations to improve accountability, transparency, and efficiency at all levels of government. But even more important, that work has provided valuable lessons that can help all of our citizens demand higher levels of accountability from those who hold their trust. In the public sector, leaders who do not uphold their responsibility, leaders who do not hold themselves accountable, can have a dramatic negative impact on their constituents. Because we are a state that needs every public leader committed to the highest levels of integrity and vision to move us forward. The bottom line is Kentucky simply has too few resources and so many critical needs. We simply must have leadership grounded in integrity and committed to long-term progress. I say that today because Kentucky, in spite of our progress on many fronts, and you've heard about some of that in this conference, still faces daunting challenges. Now, some of these numbers are in the report Dave just went over, and it's the first time I've seen it this afternoon, and it's good to know that we are on the same page, because this is a list of facts that political leaders don't like to talk about, but it's exactly what we ought to be talking about. We're at 82% of the national average in per capita income, but that's the state average. We have counties as low as 60% of the national per capita income. The latest census data shows we have the 5th highest poverty rate in the nation. That means roughly 1 in 8 families and 1 in 4 children in Kentucky live in poverty today. Kentucky led the nation last year in deaths from child abuse and neglect. We've had one of the fastest rates of growth for our inmate population in America, largely driven by an epidemic drug abuse problem. We're one of the worst states in the nation for heart disease and lung disease and cancer. In fact, we now have the highest mortality rate for cancer in America. We have more citizens receiving Medicaid, health care for the poor and disabled, than we have in the elementary and secondary and higher education school systems combined. And still today, in spite of all the progress that we've made and the fact that we're moving in the right direction, still today for every 20 kids who enters the 9th grade, 3 of them are graduating from college. These are the challenges we face as a state. This is what every elected leader should be focused on every day. This is why we need all of our citizens engaged in demanding accountability, and this is why the role of the Chamber is so important. The research and policy recommendations that have come out of the State Chamber in recent years have helped identify how the pressures in state spending are stifling our ability to invest in ways that truly change the future. In fact, the Chamber is one of the few voices in the state calling attention to the long-term policy challenges we face as a state, especially since the state's long-term policy research center was abolished as a victim of budget cuts a few years ago. You've pointed out in the leaky bucket reports, and again here today, that the dramatic growth in Medicaid, prisons, and pension costs have prevented our investing adequately in education. Yet our lack of educational attainment is the fundamental barrier to progress on every one of the other fronts that I listed. And this move to a knowledge-based economy will leave our people further behind if they don't have the skills to compete effectively. The state's challenges require future leaders at every level who have the integrity, the competence, and the vision to tackle these problems head-on. A study several years ago by the Kentucky Science and Technology Corporation concluded it would take 150 years to reach the current national average in per capita income if we continue the course that we're on. And of course, per capita income is one of the most important indicators that measures the health of our economy. We need new strategies to build a new Kentucky. We need long-term strategies that transcend administrations, that direct our investments where they need to go to be sure that we stay on a course of progress. And we need our public and private leaders to work together to connect the dots and form strategic linkages among our key policy areas. You heard this touched on in the earlier discussion from our higher ed leaders today. But one set of linkages we need to strengthen is between K-12 education and higher education and the business community. We're too often graduating students from high school without the skills to succeed in college, and not graduating enough students from college prepared for the jobs of the future. We need similar strategies to connect the dots among policies governing criminal justice, environmental regulation, economic development, energy, and health care, all with a long-term view to the future. All of the problems that I have listed today and that you've heard about in this conference are interrelated, and we can't approach them unless we connect all of our strategies together to try to address the solutions. But today, even as Kentucky faces these long-term challenges, we find ourselves in dire financial circumstances. As we've wrestled with more than $3 billion in state budget shortfalls in the last 3 years, we've dramatically impacted vital education and human services. And the state's biennial budget passed this spring made yet another round of cuts to education, including significant cuts to higher education, over 6%, that have again driven up tuition at every public institution. That was discussed earlier today by the higher education leaders, and they're trying to be very nice about it. But that's a policy decision that has been made by the leadership of this state to shift a burden to the people who least need it at a time when we need them to find every possible way they can move forward with their education.